What's up guys, welcome back to another video in the diesel build series. As you can tell by the title of this video, today we're going to be getting the coilovers actually mounted on the front of the truck. If you saw in the previous video, we did get the radius arms made and mounted up underneath the truck. And today we need to go ahead and now get the lower shock mount made off the radius arm, as well as the shock tower that will be holding the upper shock mount. And the coilovers we'll be using for the front of this truck, if you haven't seen in the previous videos, is a Fox 2.5 by 10 inch diameter coilover. This is just a standard 2.5 coilover. It does have the 90-degree fittings on it, so that way, once I have the shock actually mounted on the truck, I can go ahead and clock this fitting how I see fit to be able to get this reservoir mounted wherever I decide I want to get that mounted off the tube work for the engine cage. And the only thing that's kind of different about this setup right here is instead of running a 3/0 diameter spring, which you typically run on a 2.5 diameter shock, I'm running a 375 diameter spring, which is a little bit bigger. This is what you typically run on a 3/0 diameter coilover. And the reason for that is because when you go to a bigger spring like this, it's kind of dispersing the load of the truck out a little bit more over the spring, which on a truck like this with a big heavy motor in the front of it, you definitely want to take advantage of that. And you can kind of play with the spring rates as well and get them a little bit lower than what you typically can with a 3/0 diameter spring, because the diameter of the spring itself is just bigger. So the force to be able to compress it is a little bit more with the bigger diameter spring. If you do decide you want to run a 375 diameter spring on a 2.5 coilover, you do need to get a different lower spring plate. This is just a little bit bigger than the standard 2.5 spring plate that you would get with the shock, as well as this upper spring plate to be able to hold the spring on. And you can tell this is a blue color, and the reason for that is because it is a king part. Yes, I know it's a Fox with a king part on it, but that's the only way you could get the 375 diameter spring to work on these coilovers. And I will be going back and coating this in black just to make sure it matches everything else on the shock later down the road. But that is what we'll be running for a coilover. And the first thing that we need to do to be able to get these going on the front of this truck is we need to work on the lower shock mount. So I do already have all my tabs made for the shock mounts and how I'm going to do all this, because I did do the passenger side already. It's already done over there. But the first part of getting these coilovers actually mounted is getting these lower tabs tacked to the top side of these radius arms right here. And I did figure out that these will end up going right here, right above this main beam bolt that holds the radius arm to the beam. And if you're going to be doing something like this, obviously make sure that your socket for whatever size bolt that you're going to be doing something over can still go in between the shock mounts or whatever tabs that you're doing. And in this case, it's an 1.1 socket that fits over this, which is perfect because the misalignments on my shocks are 1.5 inch width. So the 1.1 socket fits right in between the shock mounts, no problem. I did play around on the other side with moving this shock mount around on this radius arm and kind of bringing it back and just seeing what works the best. And I did determine that being as far forward as I could on this radius arm was the best place for it, because using that 375 spring, it did come in contact with the frame if I had the shock mount pushed forward any more than where it was all the way up here. In most cases, I do typically run the lower coilover mount off the front side of the beam down here, because it brings the coilover down a little bit further, which helps with clearance up at the top, which you'll see later in this video how tight things get with the master cylinder and stuff up there. But because I am running the stock beams on this truck still, I do not want to weld to these things at all. I want to keep those exactly how they are and not put any heat into those. I know some people say that it is okay to weld to stock beams if you heat them up or do different things, but I do not even want to chance it. And the coilover mount coming off the top side of the radius arm in this instance is going to be perfectly fine. So the first thing you want to do when you're mounting shock mounts on a vehicle is you want to go ahead and get that lower pivot point or your lower shock mount put on the suspension first, whether it be on the front or the rear of a vehicle. And then you want to go ahead and get the truck to full bump or full compression. And then you want to get your shock and fully compress it and put it up in there in the lower shock mount. And that will determine where your upper shock mount is going to be. One thing that you never want to do is start with your upper shock mounts, because that will let the shock determine where the vehicle is actually going to bottom out at, and that can hurt the performance of the vehicle. So you always want to have the tire stuffed up into the truck as far as you possibly can to be able to get the most up travel out of the vehicle as you can and keep your ride height down. And the reason that's important is because if you have a very tall ride height, it can have a lot of body roll and have the truck want to roll over and do different things, which obviously you do not want that if you're going to be off-roading the truck and doing things at a high rate of speed, which in this case, it's not that big of a deal, but I do want to keep the ride height of the vehicle down and not have it be lifted super, super tall. And I do still want to have a good amount of up travel from ride height on the vehicle. So you always want to start with the lower pivot point or your lower shock mount instead of the upper shock mount and work your way from the bottom up. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead, get my lower shock mounts cut out right now and get them tacked to the radius arm so we can start cycling everything to full bump. And then we can get this coilover compressed, get the spring off of it, and get this held up in there so we can start seeing where the upper shock mounts are going to be going. Got my lower shock mounts all cut out, got the holes drilled in them, got them tacked onto the top side of the radius arm as a full assembly with a bolt going through them and my spacer right here, which is 1.5 inches width plus 30 thousandths. So you've probably heard me talk about this before in other videos. Whenever I'm mounting something in between two tabs like this, I always go 30 thousandths over whatever the mounting width is. So in this case, the misalignments are 1.5 inches width. I went 30 thousandths over that with this spacer. And the reason I do that is because when everything gets welded, like I'll weld these together with this spacer in there when I go ahead and finally weld all that stuff together. When I go ahead and put this shock into the tabs, it'll have everything mount nice and easy. And one thing I want to point out real quick too is the position of these tabs and the direction that they're actually being pointed in. And the reason that you can tell they're kind of splitting the beam and the radius arm, they go in between, is because when the shock cycles, you want the misalignments not to misalign a whole bunch. So if you had your tabs pointed like this and your shock is going back at an angle like this, you're going to be using the misalignments and they're going to be pivoting quite a bit. Whereas if you make the shock mounts, your lower and upper shock mounts, kind of splitting the difference of the I-beam and the radius arm, they're only going to be pivoting, your misalignments are only going to be pivoting on the bearing instead of actually misaligning. So that's one little trick right there. And you can see, go ahead, get my 1.1 inch socket, fits right in between the tabs, no problem. Can go ahead and get that bolt tightened, get it loosened, whatever I need to do, and I'll be able to get that bolt out of there without an issue. Now what I need to do is get the beam and radius arm up to full compression, and I have already cycled everything with the tire on here and kind of figured out the max amount of height I can get without hitting the inner fender well or the fender. And I came to a conclusion that 22.25 inches is going to be full bump on this truck. And that's measuring from the bottom side of the radius arm down to the ground. So I do need to get this up to that height. And then I do have the coilover all ready to go already. I got everything compressed, took the nitrogen out of it and compressed it. And then I got the spring off of it as well. And I did leave these spring retainers on here, and this upper one is just free floating. And the reason that I want that stuff on there is because when I get the shock actually positioned up in here, when it's at full bump, I want to make sure that I can move that spring retainer around on the shock and it's not going to hit the frame at all, because these spring retainers are basically the same diameter as the spring itself. So I'll be able to move that around on the shock body and make sure it clears everything inside of here. Another thing I'll need to do, which I've already kind of started doing as you can see, is clearance out the inner fender well for the shock to clear as well as the spring. And this was just a rough cut to be able to fit this shock in here, just so I can kind of get an idea where the top of the shock was going to be just a while ago, just to kind of start figuring out shock mount ideas and kind of brainstorming that. But I am going to need to cut this out quite a bit more, and then once the engine cage comes in here, I'm going to be cutting it out quite a bit more. So I do need to start clearancing this out to be able to fit the shock, so I'll start doing that as well. finally starting to get somewhere. So you saw I cut these tabs out off camera. I went ahead, got this tube cut to length and got it fit to the bottom side of the frame. But you can see right here, the tolerance between the master cylinder and the shock mount is pretty close. This is what I was referencing before with the clearance issues on the top side up here, but this is pretty good clearance. This will never touch. I am going to be remaking these brake lines for the front of the truck anyways, which all this down here is going to be in the way for the other tube that I'm going to be running down to the frame as well. So all this stuff will be getting deleted, but that is not an issue. The other kind of tight spot is right there to the column, but there's plenty of room even for the column to kind of wiggle around, which it will when it's under load and stuff like that. So all that is good. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead, get these tabs and tube broke out of the truck, basically break the tack down at the bottom, pull this out, and then what I'll do is weld all this stuff up on the bench, and then I also have a plate that comes up over the top of this, just kind of cap all this stuff off. So I'll do that out of the truck just to make it a little bit easier. You can see I do have my little shock shims in here to kind of space everything out to the 30 thousandths tolerance. So when I pull this out of the truck to weld it on the bench, I'll go ahead, obviously pull the shock out of it, and get my tab or my little spacer put in there, and then burn all this stuff together so everything has the correct tolerance. So I did go ahead and get this shock mount all burned together. I did get this top plate on here, as you can see, kind of caps everything off and just cleans it all up so you don't see the two tabs and that open side of the tube. So now I can go ahead and get the other two tubes for the engine cage actually put on once I get this tube back in the truck. One's going to come from this side of the shock mount and go down to the frame, and then one's going to go from this side of the shock mount and go down to the frame. As you can tell on these, I did go ahead and weld up all the way around the tabs up to the inside. I did it up there at the top too before I put this top kind of gusset plate on there as well, just to kind of hold these two main tabs onto the tube a little bit better, and they won't have a tendency to want to rip away from this piece of tubing right here. So this can go back in the truck right now, and then I can start working on getting those other two tubes in place. Alright, little chop cut trim, got these tubes in place. I did start with this back tube first because it is just a straight tube. I didn't have to put any bends in it. And this front tube up at the top, you can see right there, I did have to put a little bit of a bend to be able to clear this retainer with the spring on it once everything's up here. I don't know where the ride height's going to be at and where these preload rings are actually going to be sitting at, but I do know I want them to clear all the way up the body, so I went ahead and just added a kick to the tube just so I know in the future everything will clear and there's not going to be a big deal up there. Did have to clearance the inner fender well out just a little bit to clear these tubes, and it is rough cut right now. I need to go back in and clean all that stuff up with a flap disc, but I'm going to do that once I have this whole engine cage out so I can weld it up on the bench and be able to get the back sides of all these tubes before it actually gets onto the truck. But I need to go ahead now and get this thing pulled out of here, but it does clear everything pretty nicely. It's pretty tight down here to the power steering pump lines, but everything still works perfectly. I can still get this cap off, no problem, but it does look really good. You can see this side and that side. That's the side I did previously off camera. They match each other real nicely, so I'm gonna go ahead and weld as much as I can up now in the truck so things don't warp as much when I weld things up on the bench, and then I'll go ahead and try and pull this whole assembly out and then weld everything up and then get it back into place. Well, this worked out perfectly. So I was able to go in, weld as much as I could while it was still sitting on the truck. That way, once I got it up on the bench, the warping was gonna be as minimal as possible because things will pull and stretch when you're welding. So if you weld as much as you possibly can up on the vehicle, how it's actually gonna be sitting, and then pull it off, you're minimizing as much warpage as possible. So everything did come out real nice. It's able to come in here, weld all this stuff together. Now I can go ahead, get this shock mount put back in the truck. I did go ahead and clean up all this inner fender well as well with a flap disc and just clean up the edges just so everything's nice and clean. So now I can go ahead, I have my spots prepped where the tubes are gonna be landing. Can go ahead and get this shock mount put back in and then burn it onto the actual truck. Well, I don't know where exactly I left off in the last clip for this video, but it has been a couple days. I did go ahead and get the engine cage all burned in to the frame and got all that situated on both sides. I did go ahead too and get a engine crossmember put in, and this is just tying the shock mounts together from one side to the other. That way these shock mounts don't want to flex in and go towards the engine at any point. And I didn't add any like removable points on this crossmember yet, and the reason for that is because I don't plan on getting anything out of here right this second. At some point this stock intake is going and there will be a turbo in here, but I do want everything here just to be nice and sturdy for the time being, because I don't plan on removing any of this stuff as of right now. You can see I've already started with brake line stuff, and the fitting for the front of the brake system right here coming out of the master cylinder, it's a 9/16 18 thread pitch, and then this just goes to a -3 fitting. So now I can go ahead and run off of this with all my stainless hardline and then start making all my brake lines from there. And I did get a package from Tyler over at CarTech. I have my limit straps that I'll be putting on the front. It's a 13-inch limit strap that I'll be running on the front of the truck, which will be getting installed right now. I just need to make some tabs for that. And then I also have all my other brake line parts to be able to get the rest of this stuff put together. But the first thing I need to do to get these limit straps on is I need to get this lower tab right here that I've already made, because I did do the other side already. I have it all in place. Is get this lower tab that actually sits on the radius arm just like so. It'll sit just like that. I'll tack that in first, and then with limit straps I like to work my way from the bottom up to the top. And the reason for that is once you have this bottom one tacked in, you can go ahead and get your shock where you want it, and then you can hold the limit strap in the lower tab, stretch it as tight as you can, and then pin your upper point with your tab, and that will hold it in place nice and tight. So with this setup being a 10-inch coilover, I'm going to go ahead and shorten the stroke of the shock 1 inch. So I'll be sitting at 9 inches on the straps, and then that allows for the strap to actually stretch under load. And comparing to the other side, I will be basically at 9.5 inches of shaft showing with this thing fully strapped out. So that leaves just a little bit of room for stretch down the road, and we should be good to go. So, limit straps are in the truck now. Went ahead, got that upper tab made, got it tacked into place, made sure everything was good, cycled the suspension up, like I was saying, to 9 inches, and made sure the stroke of the shock wasn't going to be sacrificing anything when this thing is at full droop. So we're only losing about 1/2 inch overall on the shaft, which ends up to about 3/4 of an inch on the wheel end, which this truck, bumped and strapped now, is going to be making 13 inches of travel. Isn't anything crazy, but with a 10-inch coilover and it being stock width, it's really not that bad. So now that this is done, I can go ahead and start doing brake lines, and then we can kind of get everything torn apart for paint and then final assembly. I am going to be doing the brake lines off camera though. I have already filmed how to do stainless steel brake lines on the 92 F1 build series, as well as on the Ranger that we did for the channel. So I won't be doing that just because it is a little bit difficult to get underneath this truck and actually film what I'm doing underneath there. But at the start of the next video on this truck, I will be showing you guys what I did and why I did it and how all that stuff works, just so you can kind of get a general idea on what I did. But in the next video, I will be painting everything and steel it, getting everything torn off the truck and painted, as well as getting everything back on, and then properly shanking all the hardware, and then getting everything tight, and then getting the torque seal on the nuts. Another thing too that I don't have on the truck yet is going to be the steering, which I have all that stuff sitting aside already. It's just all stock replacement steering with a drop down pitman arm, which I will be installing in the next video as well as final assembly. And then we can go ahead and get the truck aligned, get it back on the ground for good, get the ride height set, and this vehicle will be done and I can actually go and drive it again. So if you guys like this video, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. We'll catch you in the next one. Peace.